village had no name anymore. Whatever it had been called before the raiders came, before the fires consumed everything, was lost to memory and ash. Now it was simply another scar on the landscape of the outer provinces, a testament to the Empire's failure to protect those who lived beyond the reach of its marble halls. Empress Lucia stood at the edge of what had once been the village square, her purple-bordered stola already stained with soot despite her attendants' best efforts to keep her pristine. The imperial retinue, guards, officials, various hangers-on, maintained a respectful distance, none quite certain why their empress insisted on visiting these scorched ruins. "Your Majesty," Tribune Marcus ventured, his tone carefully neutral, "there is nothing here to see. The attack was 3 days ago. The survivors have been relocated. Perhaps we should continue our tour?" Lucia finished for him, not taking her eyes off the devastation. "Return to our comfortable carriages and pretend we've done our duty?" Marcus's silence was answer enough. Lucia was used to such suggestions. At 26, she'd been Empress for 4 years, long enough to understand that her role was largely ceremonial, that real power resided with the Emperor and his Senate, that she was expected to be decorative, pious, and fertile. She'd managed the first 2. The third had so far eluded her, much to everyone's disappointment. "The raiders came from the north," she said, "crossed the frontier during the new moon. They took everything of value, and they burned the rest. Standard tactics for barbarians, Your Majesty," Marcus replied. "Tragic, but not uncommon." "Where were the legions when this village burned?" Lucia asked quietly. "Where were the soldiers whose purpose is to prevent exactly this?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "The northern sector has been undermanned for months, Majesty. General Cassian withdrew 3 cohorts for his campaign in Germania." At the mention of her father's name, Lucia felt the familiar mixture of pride and frustration. General Cassian, the Lion of Rome, the undefeated commander who had expanded the Empire's borders further than any man in generations. The father who had been more absent than present throughout her childhood, always choosing military glory over his only child. A sound cut through her bitter reflection, so faint she almost missed it. A cry, weak, hoarse, but unmistakably human, and unmistakably young. Lucia's head snapped toward the source. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what, Majesty?" Marcus asked, his hand moving to his gladius. "That." Lucia was already moving, gathering her stola as she picked her way through the wreckage. "Someone's alive." "Your Majesty, wait." Lucia ignored him, following the sound to what had once been the village's largest structure. The roof had collapsed inward, but in the corner, protected by a fallen beam that had created a small shelter, something moved. Lucia dropped to her knees and peered into the gap. What she saw made her breath catch. A baby, no more than a few months old, wrapped in charred rags. The child's face was smudged with soot, its tiny fists clenched, its mouth open in another weak cry. How it had survived 3 days without food or water was beyond comprehension. "Guards," Lucia commanded, "clear this debris, carefully. There's a child here." The soldiers rushed forward, and within minutes they'd created enough space for Lucia to reach in and gently lift the infant into her arms. The child was lighter than it should have been, its skin hot with fever, its breathing rapid and shallow. But it was alive. "Impossible," breathed one of the guards. "Nothing could have survived this long without—" "And yet," Lucia interrupted, cradling the child against her chest, "here we are. Tribune Marcus, have we any supplies? Water?" "Yes, Majesty, but—" "The child is likely diseased. Exposure, no care for days. Our physicians should examine it before you—" "Before I what?" Lucia asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Before I show compassion to a helpless infant. Before you risk your health," Marcus finished diplomatically. "The Emperor would be displeased if anything happened to you." The Emperor, her husband, Emperor Quintus Aurelius Severus, who valued her primarily for her bloodline and her potential to produce heirs, who had married her because her father's military successes had made an alliance with General Cassian politically advantageous. "The Emperor is always displeased with something," Lucia replied. "Bring me water, and send someone to fetch a wet nurse. This child needs immediate care." As Marcus hurried to comply, Lucia looked down at the infant. The child had stopped crying, perhaps soothed by human contact after days of isolation. Its eyes, bright despite the fever, fixed on her face with an intensity that seemed too aware. "Who were you?" Lucia whispered. "Where are your parents?" The answer was obvious. The child's parents were dead, killed in the raid or the fire. No one had been left to protect this infant. It had survived through pure chance, and whatever stubborn will to live existed in its tiny body. One of the priestesses who traveled with the retinue approached, her expression troubled. "Your Majesty, if I may speak." "You may." "The omens surrounding this discovery are inauspicious. A child found in ashes, touched by fire and death, without name or family. The augurs would say this is a creature touched by misfortune, that to keep it close would invite disaster." "Would they?" Lucia asked coolly. "How convenient that the gods' will always aligns with what's most comfortable for those in power." The priestess paled, but said nothing. Marcus returned with water, which Lucia used to carefully wet the child's lips. The infant latched onto the water desperately. "A messenger has been sent for a wet nurse," Marcus reported. "Though, Your Majesty, I must advise, we are still a day's travel from the capital. The child may not survive the journey." "Then we travel quickly," Lucia replied. One of the elder advisors, a man named Cassius, approached carefully. "Your Majesty, you cannot possibly be considering keeping this child." "Can't I?" "It has no family, no name, no status," Cassius explained. "To bring such a creature into the imperial household would be highly irregular. And if you're thinking of adoption, imperial law is quite clear. Only children of proven noble lineage may be adopted into the ruling family." "I'm aware of imperial law," Lucia said. "I'm also aware that laws can be changed. With respect, Majesty, the Emperor would never approve, and the Senate does not dictate my private actions," Lucia interrupted. "Nor does my husband when it comes to how I choose to show charity." "This goes beyond charity, Your Majesty," Cassius pressed. "To take in a foundling, to raise it as your own, people will talk. They'll question your judgment, your fitness for your role." There it was, the implication about her childless state, that perhaps the gods had denied her children because she was somehow unworthy. Lucia looked down at the child in her arms, this nameless, parentless infant who had survived against all odds, and she made a decision that would alter the course of history. "This child is mine now," she said quietly but firmly. "I claim it as my own, by right of rescue and right of mercy. Let whoever wishes to object do so directly to me." The assembled officials exchanged worried glances, but none dared contradict an empress to her face. Only Cassius spoke again. "Your father should be informed, Majesty. General Cassian will have opinions on this matter." "My father," Lucia said, "is hundreds of miles away, conquering lands that don't need conquering while villages like this one burn. He lost the right to have opinions about my life when he chose military glory over being present for his daughters." She turned away from them all, cradling the child close, and walked toward the carriage that would carry them back toward Rome, toward the imperial palace, toward the confrontation she knew was inevitable. "You are mine now," she whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to the infant's soot-stained forehead. "And I will protect you. I swear it on every god that failed your village. I will not fail you." The child's eyes fluttered closed, finally surrendering to exhausted sleep, trusting in the warmth and safety of the Empress's embrace. Neither of them knew that this moment, this choice would set in motion events that would shake the very foundations of the Roman Empire. But in that moment, surrounded by ash and ruin, Lucia didn't care about empires or politics or the weight of expectation. She cared only about the child in her arms and the promise she had just made. A promise that would cost her everything, and ultimately save everything. The confrontation came faster than Lucia had anticipated. She'd barely had 3 days with the child. 3 days of watching the infant's fever break under the careful ministrations of the imperial physicians. 3 days of holding the small body against her chest and feeling its heartbeat grow stronger. 3 days of imagining a future where this foundling became something more than a tragic footnote. 3 days before the emperor summoned her to the throne room. Lucia had dressed carefully that morning, choosing her most formal stola, the one embroidered with golden thread. She'd arranged her dark hair in the intricate style favored by the nobility, had adorned herself with jewelry that spoke of wealth and power. She looked every inch the Empress of Rome. But as she walked through the marble corridors toward the throne room, the child wrapped securely in fine linen and held close to her chest, Lucia felt the weight of every eye upon her. Servants paused to watch her pass, their expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. Word had spread quickly. The Empress had brought back a foundling from the provinces and was treating it as her own. The great bronze doors of the throne room stood open. Inside, the space was deliberately overwhelming. Soaring columns, frescoed ceilings depicting divine victories, the imperial throne elevated on a dais that forced all who approached to literally look up at the emperor. Emperor Quintus sat on that throne now, his expression carved from ice. Around him stood the apparatus of power, senators in white togas, military commanders in polished armor, priests in sacred robes. "Empress Lucia," Quintus said, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. "Approach." Lucia walked forward with her head held high, the child still cradled against her. She stopped at the traditional distance. "My emperor," she acknowledged with a slight bow of her head. "You have returned from the provinces," Quintus observed, "and you have brought something with you. Or should I say someone?" "I have," Lucia replied evenly. "An infant I discovered in the ruins of a village destroyed by raiders. The only survivor." "A foundling," Quintus said, and the word carried unmistakable disdain. "Of unknown parentage, unknown bloodline, touched by death and disaster." "I brought a child," Lucia corrected gently. "A helpless infant who would have died without intervention. Tell me, wife, what exactly do you intend to do with this child?" The question hung in the air. Lucia was acutely aware that this was not a private conversation. This was a public examination, conducted before witnesses who would carry their words to every corner of Rome. "I intend to raise the child as my own," Lucia said clearly, "to adopt it legally and give it a place within our household." The reaction was immediate. Gasps echoed through the throne room. One of the priests made a sign against evil. Several senators began speaking at once. "Silence," Quintus commanded, and the room obeyed instantly. He leaned forward on his throne. "Do you understand what you're proposing? Imperial law is explicit. Only children of proven noble lineage may be adopted into the ruling family. This is not arbitrary tradition. This is divine law established by the gods themselves to ensure the purity of Rome's leadership." "Divine law," Lucia repeated. "Established by men who claim to speak for the gods. Tell me, husband, which god demands we abandon helpless infants to die in ruins? Which god?" Quintus's voice rose dangerously. "All of them. The foundling is marked by misfortune, touched by death. To bring such a creature into the imperial family would pollute the sacred bloodline." "Sacred bloodline," Lucia murmured, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "You married me not because of any divine mandate, but because my father's military success made an alliance with General Cassian advantageous." The room went deathly quiet. One did not speak to the emperor this way, certainly not in public. Quintus's face flushed with anger. "How dare you?" "I dare," Lucia interrupted, "because I am Empress of Rome, daughter of the empire's greatest general, and I will not be lectured about divine will by men who conveniently interpret the gods' wishes to align with their own prejudices." "This is not about prejudice," one of the high priests interjected. "This is about maintaining the sacred order. A ruler's heir must bear divine blood. This child has no lineage, no name, no divine favor." "An abomination," Lucia said softly, looking down at the child. "You call this innocent life an abomination? This child, who survived impossible odds, you would rather it had died in those ruins than live to challenge your comfortable certainties." She looked at Quintus. "And you, my husband, you sit on your throne and speak of divine law while villages burn, because you're too busy conquering new territory to protect your own people. Tell me, which is the greater abomination?" "You go too far," Quintus thundered, rising from his throne. "I have been patient with you, wife. I have tolerated your opinions, your stubborn independence, your failure to provide me with an heir. But this defiance I will not tolerate." The words hit Lucia like physical blows. Her failure to provide an heir. "Then what will you do?" Lucia asked, her voice steady despite the tears threatening. "Punish me for showing mercy?" "If necessary," Quintus said coldly. "You have defied divine law and imperial decree. You have brought pollution into the sacred household." He descended from the dais, approaching Lucia. When he stood before her, she could see the calculation in his eyes. This wasn't about the child. This was about power, about control. "I give you a choice," Quintus said quietly, though his voice carried through the chamber. "Abandon this foundling. Have it placed with a suitable family far from Rome. Do this, and you may retain your position." "And if I refuse?" "If you refuse," Quintus replied, "you will be stripped of your titles and cast out from the imperial household. Your name will be erased from the official records. You will cease to be empress." It was exactly what he wanted. An excuse to rid himself of the barren wife who spoke too boldly, who reminded him too much of her formidable father. Lucia looked down at the infant in her arms. The child had quieted, its small hand wrapped around her finger, its eyes, dark and trusting, fixed on her face. She thought of her father, hundreds of miles away. She thought of her mother, who had taught her that true nobility came from actions, not bloodlines. She thought of every comfortable lie she'd been told about divine favor, and she made her choice. "I refuse," Lucia said clearly. "I will not abandon this child. If that costs me my title, so be it. But I will not betray an innocent life." Quintus's expression didn't change, but Lucia saw satisfaction flicker in his eyes. He'd gotten what he wanted. "So be it," the Emperor declared. "Empress Lucia, by your own choice and your own defiance of divine law, I hereby strip you of all titles and privileges. You are no longer Empress of Rome. Guards, remove her from the palace, and take the foundling to be placed in the care of the state orphanage." "No!" Lucia clutched the child tighter as guards moved toward her. "You cannot!" Strong hands grabbed Lucia's arms. She struggled, but there were too many guards. They pried the infant from her arms despite her protests. The child began to wail, a sound that cut through Lucia's heart. "Please," Lucia begged, all dignity abandoned. "Please don't do this." They were dragging her backward now, toward the great bronze doors, away from the child whose cries grew more desperate. Lucia fought every step, but it was useless. "I will come back," Lucia shouted. "I swear it." The doors slammed shut. The last thing Lucia saw was the infant being carried away by a stern-faced matron, its small arms reaching back toward her. Within minutes, Empress Lucia ceased to exist. In her place stood simply Lucia, a woman with no title, no home, no power. They stripped her jewelry, replaced her fine stola with plain wool. "You have 1 hour to leave the palace grounds," Tribune Marcus said quietly. "I'm sorry, my lady. Truly." Lucia barely heard him. All she could hear was the echo of the child's cries. They led her to a side gate and simply pushed her through. The gate clanged shut behind her with finality. Lucia stood there for a long moment, stripped of everything that had defined her. No longer Empress, no longer wife. Her name would be erased from official records. But as she started walking, with no destination in mind, Lucia made herself a promise. She would get that child back, somehow, someway, even if it took years, even if it cost everything. And if the Emperor thought this was over, he had gravely underestimated her father's wrath. Because someone had forgotten, General Cassian, the Lion of Rome, was not a man who forgave those who hurt his daughter, and word was already spreading to the northern frontiers. The storm was coming. The messenger reached General Cassian's camp on the 14th day after Lucia's exile. The army of Germania, 10,000 men strong, hardened by years of continuous campaigning, was encamped along the Rhine frontier, preparing for the spring offensive. It was brutal, methodical work, the kind that had earned Cassian his fearsome reputation. The Lion of Rome, they called him. Undefeated in 30 years of service, architect of Rome's greatest territorial expansion since Julius Caesar. But on this particular morning, General Cassian was not thinking about Germanic tribes or spring offensives. He was reading a letter that had arrived by imperial courier the night before, and with each word his expression grew darker. Tribune Valerius, who had served as Cassian's second-in-command for a decade, watched his general's face and felt cold dread settle in his stomach. He'd seen Cassian angry before, had seen him order decimations, had seen him burn entire villages. But this was different. This was personal. "When?" Cassian asked, his voice deadly quiet. 2 weeks ago, sir," Valerius replied. "The messenger rode as fast as horses would carry him. He says the Lady Lucia has been seen begging in the streets of Rome, that she sleeps in doorways, that her name has been erased from all official records." Cassian crumpled the letter in his fist. "My daughter, the Empress of Rome, cast out like a common criminal because she dared to show mercy to an orphaned child. The Emperor claims she defied divine law," Valerius said carefully, "that she brought pollution into the imperial household." "Divine law," Cassian repeated, and the words came out like a curse. "Divine law according to priests who interpret the god's will to suit imperial politics. Divine law that demands we abandon helpless infants while we conquer lands we don't need and can't defend." He stood abruptly, the camp stool clattering behind him. "Assemble the officers, all of them. We're breaking camp." "Sir?" Valerius blinked. "But the spring offensive, The Emperor's orders were explicit. The Emperor, Cassian interrupted, his voice carrying cold fury, has just made the gravest mistake of his reign. He cast out my daughter. He erased her name. He turned to face Valerius directly. Tell me, Tribune, how important is the Rhine frontier compared to that? Valerius swallowed hard. Not very important at all, sir. Correct answer. Now go. Assemble the officers. We march for Rome. Within an hour, the camp was in controlled chaos. Word had spread quickly. The general's daughter had been wronged, and the Lion of Rome was going to do something about it. Soldiers who had never met Lucia found themselves caught up in the righteous anger of their commander. This wasn't about politics or territory. This was about honor, about family, because Cassian had always taken care of his men. He'd fought beside them, shared their rations, visited their wounded. He was a hard man, demanding and sometimes brutal, but he was fair, and he never forgot his own. Now someone had hurt his daughter, and 10,000 soldiers who owed their lives to the Lion of Rome were more than willing to remind the Emperor what happened when you wronged General Cassian's family. The march south took 12 days. They moved with the speed and efficiency of a veteran army. Word spread ahead of them like wildfire. General Cassian was coming, and he was bringing his army, and he was not stopping at the city gates. By the time they reached the outskirts of Rome, the Senate was in emergency session. Messengers had been dispatched to other legions, calling them to defend the capital. But those legions were weeks away, scattered across the empire, and Cassian was here now, with 10,000 loyal soldiers. They made camp on the Campus Martius, the traditional military training ground outside Rome's walls. It was a deliberate choice. Close enough to be threatening, positioned where the entire city could see the eagle standards of Rome's most successful army. Cassian himself rode to the city gates at the head of a small delegation. He wore his full military regalia, the armor that had seen 100 battles, the crimson cloak of a commanding general, the decorations that marked 3 decades of service. But it was his face that made the guards at the gate step back nervously. "I am General Cassian," he announced, his voice carrying across the forum beyond the gates. "I have come to speak with the Emperor. Open the gates." The guards looked at each other nervously. One stepped forward. "General, sir, we have orders. No armed forces are to enter the city without explicit imperial permission." "I see," Cassian said calmly. "And do your orders specify what you're supposed to do if I simply walk in anyway?" The guard paled. "Sir, because here's what's going to happen," Cassian continued, his voice still perfectly calm, but carrying an edge that made hardened soldiers flinch. "I'm going to enter Rome. I'm going to walk through these gates, through the forum, straight to the imperial palace. And I'm going to have a conversation with the man who cast out my daughter. Now, you can try to stop me, in which case you'll die and I'll simply walk over your bodies. Or you can be smart, step aside, and let me pass. Your choice." It wasn't really a choice. The gates opened. Cassian walked into Rome with his head held high, his delegation behind him, and what felt like the entire city watching. Word had already spread. The Lion of Rome had come for his daughter. This wasn't a military operation. This was something more primal. This was a father's rage given form. The Senate tried to intercept him at the forum. Cassian barely slowed down. "Senators," he acknowledged with a curt nod, not stopping. "I suggest you clear a path." "General, please." Senator Marcellus stepped forward. "We understand your anger, but storming into the palace will only make things worse. There are proper channels." "Proper channels," Cassian repeated, finally stopping. He looked at Marcellus with eyes that had seen more death than most men could imagine. "Tell me, Senator, what proper channels exist for a father whose daughter was cast out into the streets? What legal procedures should I follow when the Emperor treats my child like garbage?" "We can negotiate." "There's nothing to negotiate," Cassian interrupted. "The Emperor made his choice. He cast out my daughter for showing mercy to an orphan child. He stripped her of everything." His voice dropped to something more dangerous than a shout. "Now I'm going to remind him that Lucia is my daughter, and that General Cassian does not forget when someone hurts his family." He started walking again, and this time no one tried to stop him. Tribune Marcus met Cassian at the palace steps. "General, the Emperor has agreed to see you, but he insists." "I don't care what he insists," Cassian said flatly. "Where is my daughter?" "The Lady Lucia was last seen in the Subura district. Some of the soldiers have been keeping watch over her, discreetly, making sure she has food, shelter." "Take me to her," Cassian commanded. "Now." The Emperor can wait. But sir, the Emperor specifically ordered. Tribune Marcus, Cassian said quietly. I have 10,000 men encamped outside the city walls. They are loyal to me personally, and right now they're very angry. If the Emperor has a problem with me seeing Lucia before I see him, he's welcome to come tell me himself. Do you think he will? Marcus swallowed hard. No, sir. Then take me to my daughter. They found Lucia in a narrow alley off the Sabura's main street, sitting with her back against a wall, sharing bread with 2 other destitute women. Her fine clothes were gone, replaced by a simple stained tunic. Her hair hung loose and tangled. But when she looked up and saw her father standing there in full military regalia, her eyes widened with joy and shame. Father, she breathed, scrambling to her feet. You're here. You came. Of course I came, Cassian said, and his voice gentled in a way his soldiers rarely heard. Someone hurt my daughter. Did you think I wouldn't? Lucia's composure, which had held for 2 weeks of degradation and hardship, finally cracked. She collapsed into her father's arms, sobbing, and Cassian held her with fierce protectiveness. I'm sorry, Lucia choked out. I defied the Emperor. I brought shame to your name. You did exactly what I raised you to do. Cassian interrupted firmly. You showed mercy when the powerful demanded cruelty. You stood by your principles. You are my daughter, Lucia, and I'm proud of you. He pulled back to look at her tear-stained face. Now, tell me about this child, the one you saved. Where is it? The Imperial Orphanage, Lucia said bitterly. They took it from me. The Emperor said it would be raised properly, without my corrupting influence. I see, Cassian said, and his voice took on that deadly quiet tone again. Well, I think it's time the Emperor and I had a conversation about what proper means. He looked at Tribune Marcus. Assemble my delegation. We're going to the palace. And Marcus, send word to my camp. Tell them to prepare for a long stay. We're not leaving Rome until this is resolved. What are you going to do? Lucia asked, hope and fear warring in her voice. Cassian smiled, and it was not a gentle expression. I'm going to remind Rome why they call me the Lion, and I'm going to make sure the Emperor understands that you cast out General Cassian's daughter at your peril. He offered Lucia his arm. Come, daughter, let's go reclaim what's yours. And as they walked toward the palace, with 10,000 soldiers waiting outside the city and an empire holding its breath, General Cassian prepared to do what he did best, win a war. The Forum Romanum had not seen this many people gathered in decades. News of General Cassian's arrival had spread through Rome like wildfire, and now citizens packed every available space, nobles in their fine togas jostling with merchants and laborers, all craning for a glimpse of what was about to unfold. The air thrummed with anticipation and fear in equal measure. Everyone understood that what happened in the next hour would reshape the empire. At the center of it all, Emperor Quintus stood on the rostra, the elevated platform from which Rome's leaders had addressed the public for centuries. He wore his full imperial regalia, purple toga, golden laurel crown, every symbol of divine authority the office could claim. But despite the trappings of power, he looked smaller somehow, diminished by the presence of the man who now approached through the parted crowd. General Cassian walked with the deliberate pace of a man who knew he commanded the moment. Lucia walked beside him, her head held high despite her stained tunic and unkempt hair. Behind them came Tribune Valerius and a delegation of senior officers, all in full military dress, presenting a united front that spoke louder than words. The crowd fell silent as Cassian reached the base of the rostra. He did not climb the steps, did not bow, did not show any of the deference traditionally owed to an emperor. Instead, he simply stood there, looking up at Quintus with the same expression he might give an enemy commander who had just made a tactical blunder. "Emperor," Cassian said, and his voice carried across the forum without effort, reaching every ear. "We need to have a conversation." Quintus's jaw tightened. "General Cassian, you were not summoned to Rome. You abandoned your post on the Rhine frontier without orders, bringing an army to the capital's doorstep. This borders on treason." "Borders on it?" Cassian's laugh was cold. "Let's be honest about what this is. I have 10,000 loyal soldiers camped outside your walls. Every man among them would follow me into the underworld if I asked. If I wanted to commit treason, Quintus, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You'd already be dead." Gasps rippled through the crowd. One did not speak to the emperor this way. The Praetorian guards flanking Quintus tensed, hands moving toward weapons. But none drew. They were outnumbered and outmatched, and everyone knew it. You dare threaten me? Quintus demanded, trying to reassert authority. I am Emperor of Rome. I speak with the voice of the gods themselves. The gods, Cassian said, and his voice dripped with contempt. You hide behind divine authority while committing very human cruelties. Tell me, Emperor, which god told you to cast my daughter into the streets? Which divine law demanded you strip her of her titles for the crime of showing mercy to an orphan child? She defied imperial decree, Quintus replied, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. She sought to adopt a foundling, a creature of unknown lineage, into the imperial household. This violates the sacred traditions that— Sacred traditions, Cassian interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade. Let's talk about tradition, shall we? The tradition of Roman virtue. The tradition of pietas, of duty, yes, but also of compassion, of mercy, of protecting the weak. You speak of divine law, but I see a man who used religion as an excuse to rid himself of an inconvenient wife. He gestured to Lucia. My daughter saved a child's life. She found an infant dying in the ruins of a village that your negligence allowed to burn. A village that fell because I withdrew troops for campaigns in Germania. Campaigns you ordered, Emperor. Campaigns to expand territory we don't need while we can't even protect our own people. The crowd was murmuring now, and Cassian heard the shift in tone. These were Romans who had lost family members to raids, who had seen the empire's priorities skew toward conquest over protection. He was speaking to their grievances as much as his own. When my daughter found that child, Cassian continued, she did what any decent Roman should do. She showed mercy. She offered protection to the helpless. And you, he pointed at Quintus, you punished her for it. You stripped her of her dignity, erased her name, cast her out like garbage. Why? Because she dared to show compassion? Or because she reminded you that an empress should be more than a decorative vessel for producing heirs? You overstep, General, Quintus said, but his voice wavered. The Praetorian guards looked uncertain now, glancing at each other, at the crowd, at the soldiers standing behind Cassian. Do I? Cassian asked. Then tell this crowd, tell all of Rome, why you really cast out my daughter. Tell them it was truly about divine law and sacred tradition. Tell them it had nothing to do with the fact that she challenged you, that she showed the courage you lack, that she put principle above politics. Quintus's face flushed red. I am the Emperor of Rome. I do not answer to you, General. I do not answer to— You answer to Rome, Cassian interrupted, and his voice rose now, filling the forum. You wear the purple, yes. You sit on the throne. But you answer to the people you govern, to the soldiers who defend your borders, to the very concept of what Rome is supposed to be. And right now, Emperor, you're failing that test spectacularly. He turned to address the crowd directly. Citizens of Rome, I ask you, is this the kind of leadership we want? An emperor who punishes mercy? Who casts out those who dare to show compassion? Who hides behind divine law while the very human consequences of his decisions burn villages and destroy lives? The crowd's murmur grew louder. Cassian could see senators in the assembly exchanging worried glances. The Praetorian guards had stopped looking at Quintus for orders and were now watching the crowd, gauging the mood. General Cassian, Senator Marcellus stepped forward, his voice attempting to be conciliatory. No one questions your love for your daughter or your service to Rome, but surely there is a way to resolve this that doesn't require whatever this is becoming. This, Cassian said, is a reckoning. The emperor made a choice. He chose cruelty over compassion, tradition over justice, his own pride over my daughter's dignity. Now he faces the consequences. He looked back at Quintus. I'm not here to overthrow you, Emperor. Despite what you may think, I'm not interested in your throne. But I am here to demand, not request, demand, that you restore my daughter's titles, her status, and her dignity, and that you return the child she saved to her care. Impossible, Quintus said immediately. The law is clear. A foundling cannot. Then change the law, Cassian interrupted. You're the emperor, aren't you? You claim divine authority. Use it. Show Rome that you can admit when you're wrong. Show us that you value justice over pride. If I cave to your demands, Quintus said, trying to regain his footing, I show weakness. I show that any general with an army can march on Rome and dictate terms to the emperor. That sets a dangerous precedent. You want to talk about dangerous precedents? Cassian's voice turned cold. Let's talk about the precedent of an emperor who punishes compassion, who treats his own wife with such contempt, who allows his pride to override his judgment. That's the precedent you're setting, Quintus, and it's one that will destroy you. He took a step closer to the rostra. I'm giving you a choice. Restore my daughter. Return the child to her care. Make this right, or, he gestured to the camp outside the walls, I stay here with my army until you do. And every day I remain, the people of Rome will see an emperor who can't even protect his own authority from one general with a legitimate grievance. How long do you think the Senate will tolerate that? How long before they start wondering if perhaps the wrong man wears the purple? The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. Cassian wasn't offering to overthrow Quintus himself, but he was making it clear that if the emperor didn't back down, others might do it for him. Quintus looked around the forum, at the crowd that was clearly sympathizing with Cassian, at the senators who were already calculating political angles, at his own guards who looked more loyal to the legendary general than to their emperor. He was trapped, and everyone knew it. The child, Quintus said finally, his voice tight. The foundling your daughter claims. It's been in the imperial orphanage for 2 weeks, healthy, well cared for. If, and I stress if, I were to allow its return to Lucia, there would be conditions. The child could not be formally adopted into the imperial line. It would be raised as a ward, not an heir. Acceptable, Cassian said immediately. Lucia never wanted to make the child an heir. She wanted to give it a home, a family, a chance at life. That's all. And what guarantee do I have? Quintus asked. That once you get what you want, you'll disband your army and return to your post? You have my word as a Roman officer, Cassian replied. And unlike some, I actually honor my oaths. Give me my daughter's status back, return the child to her care, and I return to Germania. You'll never see my army at your gates again, unless you give me another reason to bring them. The forum held its breath. Quintus looked at Lucia, who stood silent and dignified despite everything she'd endured, looked at Cassian, whose face showed no mercy and no compromise, looked at the crowd, at the senators, at the guards, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. So be it, Quintus said, and his voice carried resignation. Lucia Cassia is hereby restored to her former status. Her titles are reinstated. Her name will be returned to the official records, and the child she rescued will be returned to her care, to be raised as her ward under imperial protection. The crowd erupted in cheers. Cassian didn't smile, but Lucia felt tears stream down her face, not of sadness this time, but of overwhelming relief. Thank you, Father, she whispered. Don't thank me, Cassian replied quietly. You earned this. You stood by your principles when it would have been easier to compromise. That takes more courage than any battle I've ever fought. As the crowd celebrated and senators scrambled to adjust to the new reality, Cassian and Lucia walked toward the imperial orphanage, ready to reclaim the child that had started it all. Behind them, Emperor Quintus stood on the rostra, his authority diminished but intact, learning the hardest lesson of his reign. Some wars aren't won with swords, and some enemies, like a father's love for his daughter, can't be defeated at all. The imperial orphanage sat at the edge of the Palatine Hill, close enough to the palace to claim association with imperial charity, but far enough to keep the reality of Rome's forgotten children at a comfortable distance. It was a large stone building, functional rather than beautiful, where children of unknown parentage were housed, fed, and trained for useful futures. Lucia's hands trembled as she approached the entrance, her father's solid presence beside her the only thing keeping her from breaking into a run. 2 weeks. 2 weeks since they'd torn the infant from her arms. 2 weeks of not knowing if the child was being cared for, if it was sick, if it even remembered her. It will be all right, Cassian said quietly, his hand on her shoulder. The child will have been fed and sheltered, but not loved, Lucia whispered. Not held when it cried, not sung to. Cassian squeezed her shoulder. Then we remedy that. Now. Tribune Marcus had gone ahead to inform the orphanage matron. As Lucia and Cassian entered, they found the woman waiting in the entrance hall. She was perhaps 60, with iron-gray hair, and a face that suggested she'd long ago stopped being surprised by anything. Lady Lucia, the matron said with a respectful bow, we were informed of the Emperor's decision. The child has been prepared for transfer. How is it? Lucia asked immediately. Healthy? Has there been any fever? The infant is in good health, the matron replied. The wet nurse assigned has been diligent. The child has gained weight and shows no signs of illness. Relief flooded through Lucia. May I see it? Now? Of course, my lady. This way. They walked through corridors lined with small rooms where children of various ages could be glimpsed, some playing quietly, others being instructed, all bearing the particular stillness of children who had learned not to expect much from life. "How many children are here?" Cassian asked. "Currently 147, the matron replied. "We receive new foundlings regularly. Many don't survive their first month. Those who do are raised until they're old enough to be placed in apprenticeships or service." "Service?" Lucia stopped walking. "Indentured service, my lady," the matron corrected carefully. "Families pay for the cost of raising them. It's the only way the orphanage sustains itself." Lucia looked at her father, horror in her eyes. This was what would have happened to the child she'd saved. A commodity to be traded. They reached a room at the end of the corridor. The matron opened the door to reveal a sparse space with several cradles. A wet nurse sat in a chair, feeding one of them. "There," the matron said, pointing to the cradle nearest the window. Lucia rushed forward. The infant lay on its back, swaddled in clean linen. It had grown in 2 weeks, was clearly healthier, its cheeks fuller, its movements stronger. And when it heard Lucia's approach, when those dark eyes found her face, the child's expression transformed. It recognized her. "Hello," Lucia whispered, reaching down to lift the infant into her arms. "Hello, little one. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't keep you safe before, but I'm here now." The child made a soft sound, not quite a cry, more like a question, and its tiny hand reached up to touch Lucia's face. Such a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of recognition, of memory, of connection that had survived 2 weeks of separation. Lucia pressed the child close to her chest, tears streaming. "You're mine now, truly mine. No one will take you from me again, I promise." Cassian watched his daughter with an expression that was part pride, part sorrow. "What will you name it?" Lucia looked down at the child, at the infant who had survived the destruction of its village, who had clung to life against impossible odds, who had inadvertently sparked a confrontation between an empress and an emperor. "Julian," she said softly, "after my mother's father, who taught me that nobility comes from actions, not bloodlines." "Julian," Cassian repeated, testing the name. "A good Roman name. The child is male, then?" the matron asked. "He is," Lucia said, looking at the infant with wonder. "He is my son, and he will grow up knowing he's loved, knowing he's wanted, knowing that his mother defied an empire to keep him safe." "About that," Cassian said, his tone shifting to something more practical. "The emperor agreed to allow you to raise the child as your ward. Julian cannot be formally adopted into the imperial line. He won't be eligible for succession. His status will be complicated." "I don't care about succession," Lucia said firmly. "Let Quintus worry about heirs. Julian will have something better than imperial status. He'll have a family. He'll have more than that," Cassian said, something calculating in his expression. "He'll have my protection. As my grandson, however unofficially, he falls under the umbrella of the Cassian family. That's not imperial status, but it's significant." He moved closer, looking down at the infant. "Hello, Julian. I'm your grandfather, apparently. Fair warning, I'm not particularly good with children. I was terrible at it with your mother, but I promise you this. Anyone who tries to harm you will answer to me personally." Julian made another small sound, and Cassian actually smiled, a rare expression that transformed his battle-hardened face. "He's strong," the general observed. "You can see it, the way he moves, the clarity in his eyes. This one's a survivor, Lucia, just like his mother." "His mother found him in ashes and fire," Lucia said quietly. "Perhaps he was meant to rise from them." "Perhaps," Cassian agreed. "Or perhaps he was just lucky that the right person found him." Tribune Marcus appeared in the doorway. "General, my lady, the palace has sent word. The emperor wishes to formalize the arrangements. Documents to sign." "Let him wait a few more minutes," Cassian said dismissively. "We're having a family moment." "Sir, the emperor was quite insistent." "The emperor," Cassian interrupted, "is learning an important lesson about patience. What's he going to do? Come drag us back? We both know how that would look." Marcus sighed but nodded. "I'll inform the palace there's been a delay." After he left, Lucia looked at her father with affection and exasperation. "You're going to antagonize him unnecessarily." "I'm going to remind him who has the real power," Cassian corrected. "He may be emperor, but I'm the one with 10,000 loyal soldiers. He'd do well to remember that. Will you return to Germania?" "I'll return to my post," Cassian said, "as I promised, but I'll leave behind a cohort. Officially for imperial security, but really to make sure Quintus doesn't try anything once I'm gone. And I'll be back regularly, to check on you, and on Julian." He reached out and gently touched the infant's hand. Julian's tiny fingers wrapped around one of the general's calloused digits with surprising strength. "You know," Cassian said thoughtfully, "I missed most of your childhood, Lucia. I was always away, always campaigning. I regret that more than you'll ever know." "Father, let me finish," Cassian said. "I can't undo my failures with you, but perhaps I can do better with him. Not as a primary guardian, that's your role, but as a grandfather who's actually present, who teaches him things." Lucia felt tears threatening again. "You don't have to. I want to," Cassian interrupted gently. "I've spent 30 years serving Rome. Perhaps it's time I also served my family. Besides, this boy will need to know how to navigate Roman politics, how to defend himself against those who will always question his origins. Who better to teach him than someone who spent a lifetime doing exactly that?" "You're going to turn my son into a general," Lucia said, smiling through her tears. "I'm going to turn your son into whatever he's meant to be," Cassian corrected. "But I'm going to make sure he's strong enough, smart enough, and connected enough to survive it. That's what grandfathers do." Julian made a contented sound, apparently satisfied with this arrangement, and both Cassian and Lucia laughed, a moment of pure joy after weeks of grief and struggle. "Come," Cassian said finally. "Let's go deal with the Emperor's paperwork and make this official. Then we can take Julian home and start building the life you fought so hard to claim." As they walked out of the orphanage, Julian safe in Lucia's arms and Cassian clearing a path, Lucia felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not naive hope, but the hard-won hope of someone who had lost everything, fought to reclaim it, and succeeded. Julian would grow up knowing that story, would understand that his mother had defied an emperor, that his grandfather had brought an army to defend them, that love, stubborn, fierce, uncompromising love, had conquered tradition and politics and divine law itself. That was a legacy worth more than any imperial title. That was a foundation on which to build an extraordinary life. 20 years later, the Senate chamber fell silent as the young man entered, his footsteps echoing off the ancient marble. At 20, Julian carried himself with a confidence that came not from arrogance but from having survived challenges that would have broken lesser men. He wore the toga of a Roman citizen, earned, not inherited, and around his neck hung a simple leather cord with a small pouch. Inside that pouch, those closest to him knew, was a piece of charred wood from the village where he'd been found as an infant, a reminder of where he'd come from, and why he fought for what he believed. "Julian Cassianus," the consul announced formally. "The Senate recognizes you." Julian moved to the center of the chamber where senators in their white togas watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Even after 2 decades, some still saw him as the foundling, the orphan who had no right to the privileges his mother and grandfather had secured for him. "Honored senators," Julian began, his voice clear and steady, "I come before you today not as a supplicant, but as a voice for those who have none. For the past 3 years, I have traveled the provinces, visiting the villages and settlements that exist at the edges of our great empire. I have seen the reality of Roman rule, not the glory celebrated in triumphal processions, but the cost paid by those who live beyond the marble halls of this city." Several senators shifted uncomfortably. Julian's reports from the provinces had been causing political headaches for months, documenting corruption, neglect, and abuse that many preferred to ignore. "I have compiled a comprehensive proposal," Julian continued, producing a scroll from his toga. "A reorganization of provincial administration, with specific provisions for protecting civilian populations, establishing permanent defensive garrisons, and creating accountability for officials who fail in their duties." "Expensive reforms," Senator Brutus observed dryly. "Paid for how?" "By redirecting funds currently wasted on corruption and unnecessary military expansion," Julian replied without hesitation. "My grandfather's campaigns have secured our borders. We don't need more territory. We need to properly govern what we already have." "Your grandfather," another senator interjected with slight emphasis on the word, "is no longer here to defend your proposals." The chamber went quiet. General Cassian had died 6 months earlier, having finally succumbed to wounds sustained in his final campaign. He'd lived long enough to see Julian come of age, to teach him everything he knew about military strategy, politics and survival. His death had been felt throughout Rome, but nowhere more deeply than by the grandson who had lost his fiercest protector. "My grandfather," Julian said quietly, "taught me that Rome's strength comes not from conquest, but from justice, that an empire that cannot protect its own people has no moral authority over anyone. He also taught me," his voice hardened, "never to be intimidated by men who mistake rhetoric for courage." The rebuke landed. Several senators looked away. "The proposal will be reviewed," the consul said diplomatically. "We thank you for your passionate advocacy." "With respect, consul," Julian replied. "The people I speak for don't need review. They need action. They need—" The chamber doors opened, interrupting him. A figure entered that made every senator rise to their feet. Lucia walked into the Senate chamber as though she'd never left. At 46, she carried the same quiet dignity she'd possessed at 26, but hardened by years of fighting for her son's place in a world that had never fully accepted him. She wore the purple-bordered stola of her rank, recently restored after Quintus's death 2 years earlier. Mater Romae, the consul greeted her with the title the people had given her, Mother of Rome. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" Lucia asked, moving to stand beside her son. "My son addresses the Senate with proposals that could save lives and strengthen the empire. Where else would I be?" She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of men who had once watched her be stripped of everything. 20 years ago, I stood before an emperor and chose mercy over comfort. I chose to save a child's life even though it cost me my title, my home, my place in this city. Many of you were there. Some of you voted to support my exile. Several senators had the grace to look ashamed. That child," Lucia continued, placing her hand on Julian's shoulder, "has become the man you see before you. A man who has dedicated his life to serving Rome, not the Rome of conquest and glory, but the Rome of ordinary people who simply want to live without fear. He has his grandfather's strategic mind, but he also has something more precious. He has compassion. He has mercy. He has the courage to speak truth to power." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The emperor, my former husband, ruled through fear and tradition. He believed that strength came from rigidity, from enforcing ancient laws regardless of their human cost. He was wrong, and Rome suffered for it." "You speak boldly for someone who was once cast out," Senator Brutus observed. "I speak boldly," Lucia corrected, "because I have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. My son's proposals aren't radical, they're practical, they're necessary, and they're exactly what Rome needs if we're to be more than an empire that devours itself from within." The consul looked between mother and son, calculating political angles. Finally, he spoke. "The Senate will take the proposals under serious consideration. We will convene a special committee to review the recommendations and report back within the month." It wasn't approval, but it wasn't rejection either. Julian and Lucia exchanged glances, recognizing a small victory. As they left the Senate chamber together, Julian spoke quietly. "Did you mean it? About having nothing left to lose?" "I did," Lucia replied. "But I also have everything that matters. I have you. I have the knowledge that the choice I made 20 years ago, the choice to show mercy when the powerful demanded cruelty, was right. That's worth more than any title or position." They walked through the forum, and Lucia noticed something that filled her with quiet satisfaction. People recognized Julian, called out greetings. The common citizens of Rome, the ones whose lives his proposals would actually improve, saw him not as a foundling of questionable origins, but as someone who fought for them. "Your grandfather would be proud," Lucia said softly. "I hope so," Julian replied. "I'm trying to build the Rome he fought for, the one worth defending, not just territories and borders, but principles, justice, mercy, the belief that every life has value, regardless of where it begins." Years later, when Julian became consul, his first act was to establish imperial orphanages throughout the provinces, funded by the state and held to strict standards of care. The second was to mandate that foundlings be given the same legal protections as any Roman child. And above his desk, he kept 3 things: a piece of charred wood from the village where he'd been born, his grandfather's military seal, and a letter his mother had written him on his 20th birthday. The letter said simply, "You were found in ashes. You rose to become light. Never forget that mercy is not weakness. It's the foundation upon which empires either stand or fall. Rome had fallen before, would fall again. But in that moment, in the reign of a man who had been saved by an act of defiance, the empire remembered what it could be, Not just power, but compassion. Not just conquest, but mercy. The foundling saved by an empress became the leader who saved an empire, and the act that once destroyed Lucia became the act that transformed Rome.